knowledge of this history of the Torah and history of the Hebrews. Thank you for the implications for our lives as we seek to follow you and seek to enter your kingdom. And now bless us around these tables as we join in the fellowship of the food and conversation and the learning process. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, today I'll wind up our look at the Year A semi-continuous Old Testament readings and talk a little bit about some other matters that have cropped up. Remember that we're not hearing or reading modern history. We're reading a religious and formational history of a people. It's a story with intent, not a detached report of events. It was written down long after the oral traditions were formed, and some of it was written and edited in another land after the people had been displaced from the promised land. Remember also that there are kings and there are kings. The book of Joshua lists 31 kings in various parts of Canaan and its immediate environs whom the Israelites defeated, and that region is only about twice the size of Los Angeles County. When you hear king, think chieftain. A kingdom might be the area, not the population, of Pasadena, Altadena, Glendale, and Burbank taken together. It might equally be considerably larger, but these are not kings like the pharaohs. And remember that many place names are not unique within the promised land. Just as there are at least 3 Pasadenas in the United States, in California, in Texas, and in Maryland, there are several towns in the promised land, each named Bethlehem, Debir, Gilgal, Ataroth, Aijalon, and the list goes on and on and on. It is sometimes hard to determine just which of several localities is meant. So we ended last time with the death of Moses. For Mount Nebo or Mount Pisgah, both names are mentioned and they're only a mile or 2 apart. God showed Moses all the land of Canaan, from Dan to Beersheba. Moses died and was buried, presumably by God, in a valley in the land of Moab opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his burial place to this day. The Israelites wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the Israelites were on the east side of the Jordan, having defeated King Sihon of the Ammonites and King Og of Bashan, and having distributed that land to the 2.5 Transjordan tribes. But the remaining 9.5 tribes had also been promised land, but across the Jordan, and they'd have to dispossess the current occupants to get it. In Joshua chapter 1, God said to Joshua, "Moses is dead, but I will be with you personally, as I was with Moses, provided you obey the law as you have been given it." Joshua then told the people to prepare their provisions and get ready to march in 3 days' time, reminding the men of the Transjordan tribes that their women, children, and livestock might stay on the eastern side of the Jordan, but that they, the fighting force, were to be in the vanguard of the army until the other tribes had taken possession of their land and God dismissed the Transjordanians. And the people, And the people answered, "All that you have commanded us we will do, and wherever you send us we will go. Just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so will we obey you. Whoever rebels against your orders and disobeys your words, whatever you command, shall be put to death. Only be strong and courageous." And you'll have to judge for yourselves just how well they ended up obeying Joshua. Joshua sent 2 men, spies, across the river to view the land, especially Jericho. They entered the house of Rahab, a prostitute in Jericho. They were noticed, and when the report went to the authorities, she hid the spies on the roof and misdirected the authorities. She told the spies that the report of God's action at the Sea of Reeds and his defeat of Sihon and Og had put fear into the hearts of those in Jericho. She asked that she and her family be dealt with favorably when Jericho was taken, and the spies agreed, provided that Rahab tie a crimson cord in the window and that she and her family remain in that house. If they went onto the street, the spies weren't to be held responsible for the consequences. Rahab agreed and told the spies to go westward into the hill country and hide there for 3 days until any search party from Jericho had returned to the city. They followed her advice, and when they returned to Joshua, told him that all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before us. So the Israelites moved camp from Abel Shittim to the Jordan proper. At the end of 3 days, the officers told them to follow the Ark of the Covenant, but not to crowd it. They were to follow about a quarter mile behind it. And we reach today's first lesson.
A reading from the book of Joshua. The Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, so that you may know that I will be with you as I was with Moses. You are the one who shall command the priests who bear the Ark of the Covenant. When you come to the edge of the waters of the Jordan, you shall stand still in the Jordan." Joshua then said to the Israelites, "Draw near and hear the words of the Lord your God." Joshua said, "By this you shall know that among you is the living God, who without fail will drive out from before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites. The Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth is going to pass before you into the Jordan. So now select 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. When the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the Ark of the Lord of all the earth, rest in the waters of the waters of the Jordan flowing from above shall be cut off. They shall stand in a single heap. When the people set out from their tents to cross out over the Jordan, the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant were in front of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the time of harvest. So when those who bore the ark had come to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests bearing the ark were dipped in the edge of the waters flowing from above stood still, rising up in a single heap off at Adam, the city that is beside the Zarethan, while those flowing towards the sea of Arabah, the Dead Sea, were wholly cut off. When the people crossed over opposite Jericho, while all Israel were crossing over on dry ground, the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation finished crossing over the Jordan. The word of the Lord.
So when everyone had crossed over, Joshua had 12 men, presumably the ones mentioned in the reading, each take a stone from the middle of the Jordan and pile them up as an enduring monument outside the place at which they'd camp that evening. And there's an additional comment that Joshua set up 12 stones in the Jordan at the place the priests carrying the ark had stood, and they are there to this day. It's possible that we have two traditions being merged here as to where the stones came from and where they ended up. The stones taken out of the Jordan were set up in Gilgal across a brook from Jericho. And when all the kings of the city-states in Canaan heard about the dry-shod crossing, their spirits melted. The text says that about 40,000 armed for war crossed over before the Lord to the plains of Jericho for battle, a considerable force, but fewer than 10% of the 600,000 men counted in the census in the book of Numbers. You should note that this crossing is a reflection, an inversion of the start of the journey. In Exodus, the people were fleeing an army chasing them. God was with them in pillars of fire and cloud, and the waters of the Sea of Reeds were parted so that the people left oppression dry-shod. In Joshua, the people are going towards the inhabitants as an army themselves. God was with them in the symbolism of the ark. The Jordan River was dried up, and they entered their patrimony dry-shod. It's a very pretty literary device. The actual crossing happened on the 10th day of the first month. What happens when the 14th becomes the 15th day of the first month? Anybody? It's Passover. This was the 40th anniversary of the original Passover. Exodus 12:48 says that no uncircumcised person may partake of the Passover meal, and it appears that all through the 40 years of wandering, no male child had been circumcised. So the Lord told Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites a second time. Well, it's more a case of you need to be circumcised now. When it was completed and the men were healed from the procedure, the Lord said to Joshua, today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt. And the place was called Gilgal, which is related to the Hebrew word galal, which means to roll. It was also called Gibeath Haraloth, hill of the foreskins. I'm not making this up. The Israelites kept the Passover in the promised land, and on the following day they ate the produce of the land, unleavened cakes and parched grain. The manna ceased on the day they ate the produce of the land. In another parallel with the Moses story, Joshua then had a theophany, an appearance of God to a person or group. Near Jericho, Joshua saw a man standing before him with a drawn sword in his hand. When asked whether he was friend or foe, the man said, neither, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Joshua fell on his face before the man and asked what he, Joshua, was commanded to do. And the commander replied, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy. An echo of what Moses was told at his theophany at the burning bush. Joshua then put Jericho under siege. All the armed men marched out around the city, followed by 7 priests blowing ram's horns, followed by priests carrying the ark, followed by a rear guard. They were to march once around Jericho, the only sound being the ram's horns. The armed men were not to make a sound unless and until Joshua told them to shout. They did this for 6 days. On the 7th day, they marched around Jericho 7 times, and at the conclusion of the 7th circuit, Joshua said, shout, for the Lord has given you the city. And when they shouted, Jericho's walls fell flat, and the entire column of armed men ranged around the city went straight inwards to the city center, fighting. Except for Rahab the prostitute and those with her in her house, everything in the city was to be devoted to, that is, separated for, destruction. All the silver, gold, bronze, and iron were sacred to the Lord and to be put into the Lord's treasury, but everyone and everything else, men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys, were to be slain. At the end of this, Joshua pronounced an oath. Cursed before the Lord be anyone who tries to build this city, this Jericho. At the cost of his firstborn he shall lay its foundation, and at the cost of his youngest he shall set up its gates. The fulfillment of the curse is recorded in 1 Kings 16:34. In the days of wicked King Ahab, Hiel of Bethel rebuilt Jericho, laying its foundation over Abiram his young firstborn, and setting up its gates over Segub his youngest. Joshua then sent men out to Ai, near Beth Aven, east of Bethel, to spy out the land. On their return, they said that only 2,000 or 3,000 men would be enough to take Ai, but the men of Ai ran them off, killing 36 of them. This disheartened the Israelites, and Joshua was perplexed. But the Lord said that the solemn ban that he had placed upon Jericho had been violated. So Joshua went tribe by tribe, casting lots, and Judah was taken. Taking Judah clan by clan, the Zerahites were taken. Taking the Zerahites family by family, Zabdi was taken. taking Zabdi's household person by person, Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, was taken. When charged, he admitted that amongst the spoils, he had seen a beautiful mantle from Shinar, 200 shekels of silver, and a gold bar weighing 50 shekels, and he took them and hid them in the ground under his tent. For reference, 10 rolls of pre-1964 silver quarters weigh about 200 shekels, and about 36 pre-1935 gold eagles weigh about 50 shekels. The Israelites took Achan, the spoils that he had coveted and taken, his sons and daughters and livestock and possessions, to the valley of Achor, Achor being the Hebrew word for trouble, and stoned Achan to death. The text also says that they burned them with fire, cast stones on them, and raised over him a great heap of stones that remain to this day. And we assume that means his family and all his goods and possessions. The Lord then told Joshua to take all his fighting force and set an ambush of the type that Hannibal used to good effect on the Romans a millennium later at Canaan. This time, the Lord being with them, the Israelites were successful, and the people of Ai were slaughtered, 12,000 of them, and the Lord gave the men the livestock and spoil, the goods, as their booty. They hanged the king of Ai. At evening they cut his body down, threw it down at the entrance to the city, and raised a great heap of stones over it. But this explains the name of the place. The word Ai means a ruin or ruins, and archaeology shows it was already a ruin at the presumed time of the entry. In one of his farewell discourses in Deuteronomy, which was not that long a time before, Moses described a covenant ceremony to be kept at Shechem after the people had crossed the Jordan. There is a pass above Shechem, bounded on the north by Mount Nebo and on the south by Mount Gerizim. Half the tribes were to stand on Mount Gerizim and utter blessings on the people, and the other tribes were to stand on Mount Ebal and utter conditional curses on the people if they broke covenant laws. Joshua took the people to Shechem and built an altar to the Lord on Mount Ebal, where they offered burnt offerings to the Lord. Then the antiphonal blessings and curses were recited, and thus the command of Moses was kept. And the Israelites then returned to their camp at Gilgal. Moses had also given rules for holy warfare in Deuteronomy chapter 20. One of the provisions stated that towns, city-states, far away were to be offered terms for peace. If they were accepted, the townsfolk were to serve at forced labor. If they were rejected, then the males were to be put to the sword, but the women, children, livestock, and goods were to be spoils of war for the Israelites. However, towns nearby or associated with the nations God was dispossessing for the Israelites were to be utterly destroyed. Men, women, children, livestock, goods. This was to keep the Israelites from being tempted to follow the religious practices of the people already in the land. Now the inhabitants of Gibeon, a nearby town, heard what had happened to Ai and didn't want the same fate for themselves. So they feigned coming from a great distance, wearing worn-out clothing and sandals, taking worn-out wineskins and sacks and dry and moldy provisions, and they bamboozled Joshua into making a peace treaty with them. 3 days later, the truth came out. The treaty was honored. Blessings, curses, oaths, and treaties had permanent effect, but the Gibeonites were made permanent servants to the Israelites. A set of campaigns to the south followed. King Adonizedek of Jerusalem, hearing the fate of Jericho and Ai and the peace that the Gibeonites had made, sent a message to King Hoham of Hebron, King Piram of Jarmuth, King Japhia of Lachish, and King Debir of Eglon, saying that the 5 city-states should attack Gibeon in reprisal for their cowardice. The Lord delivered these Canaanites into the hands of the Israelites and even rained huge stones from heaven on them. They're called hailstones later in the verse, but I like to think of them as being meteorites. This is the battle at which Joshua said, sun stand still in Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Aijalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, until the nation took vengeance on their enemies. This should probably be taken as a desire on the part of Joshua for the time required to do the job of destruction properly, rather than as a statement that the earth actually stopped rotating for 24 hours. Their armies destroyed, the 5 kings hid in a cave at Makkedah. Joshua had them brought out and submitted to indignities, then had them returned to the cave and had the cave sealed up, an end for them suitable for an Edgar Allan Poe story. Joshua's army then destroyed Makkedah, then Libnah and Lachish. Their armies had been destroyed, but Joshua took the fight to the cities themselves. When King Horam of Gezer came to help the city of Lachish, Joshua's army defeated them and left no survivors. They then destroyed Eglon, Hebron, and Debir, so that the reprisals of all 5 kings and 1 latecomer came upon themselves instead. Joshua and his army went back to camp in Gilgal. There followed several campaigns in the north. King Jabin of Hatzor heard of the southern king's defeat and sent to King Jobab of Madon and the kings of Shimron, Achshaph, the northern hill country, the Arabah, and a whole slew of others, who joined their forces and camped at the waters of Merom, ready to fight the Israelites. And again, the Lord gave these kings and their armies to the Israelites, who hamstrung their horses, burned their chariots, and chased the stragglers as far as Sidon to the north and the valley of Mizpeh to the east. The book of Joshua, written by Deuteronomistic authors, describes clear-cut, rapid subjugation of the promised land, from the desert in the south to the mountains in the north. Alas, things were not actually that clear-cut. There are even places within the book of Joshua that make it plain that not everyone was exterminated, and the book of Judges makes it plainer still. But the Deuteronomistic authors were writing over 600 years later, from near the time of the destruction of Jerusalem, or even from Babylon, and were trying to make it clear that obedience to the Lord brought victory and prosperity, and that disobedience to the Lord brought defeat and ignominy, which was the situation in the Babylonian captivity. Modern biblical historians feel that the conquest of the land was a much less unified event, that there were military struggles to be sure, but there was also gradual infiltration and even peasant revolt by the Canaanite worker class in the villages away from the aristocracy in the cities. In fact, the next part of the book of Joshua, dealing with the distribution of the land to the 12 Israelite tribes, admits that the conquest was not immediate and complete. Chapter 13, which follows the accounts of the campaigns in the center, the south, and the north, begins, "Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, 'You are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be possessed,'" going on to list regions. The allocation of the land was to be done by lot, except that Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh had already managed to finesse the good livestock raising land in the Transjordan. First, Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the loyal spy from 40 years ago, the only one permitted to actually enter the land with the rest of the Israelites, was given the city of Hebron for his inheritance. Then the lottery began. I'll note that the regions are given by boundaries in the text, which are often expansive, like patent claims, and often are no longer determinable today. Then by a list of the cities within those boundaries, and a note that the cities had unnamed villages associated with them. The occupation does not begin with no infrastructure. The first lot came up for Judah, and the map shows approximate, and possibly optimistic boundaries for it. Next, the Josephites, the tribe of Ephraim, and the remaining half-tribe of Manasseh received their allotments. And then things seem to have stopped, because in chapter 18, Joshua tells the tribes assembled at Shiloh, how long will you be slack about going in and taking possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, has given you? Provide 3 men from each tribe, and I will send them out that they may begin to go throughout the land, writing a description of it with a view to their inheritances. Then come back to me. They shall divide it into 7 portions, Judah continuing in its territory to the south, and the house of Joseph in its territory to the north. You shall describe the land in 7 divisions, and to bring the description here to me, and I will cast lots for you here before the Lord our God. When this had been completed, the lottery resumed, giving land to Benjamin, Simeon. Simeon is a special case because it was given some hard-scrabble near desert cities within Judah and basically disappeared. Then Zebulun, Issachar, Asher, Naphtali, and finally Dan. Dan suffered the fate of being unable to take possession of their initial allotment, and they ultimately moved far to the north, and they too went into decline, but it led to the saying, from Dan to Beersheba, to indicate the totality of the promised land. The Israelites then gave the city of Timnath-Serah to Joshua as his special inheritance. 6 cities of refuge were then named to provide asylum to those accused of murder until the case could be judged. The nearest relative of a murdered person was the avenger of blood for that person, but the cities of refuge provided an opportunity to demonstrate that the death was not murder, but accidental or involuntary manslaughter, which was not punishable by death. Finally, 48 Levitical cities were named where the Levites would live, with limited pasture land, a few hundred acres, surrounding them. This seems to fly in the face of the earlier report that the tribe of Levi would receive no land at all, that their offering of sacrifices before the Lord was their inheritance. Joshua then released the Transjordanian tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, from their military service. They were free to return home to their families and live the same life that the tribes in the promised land would live. A long time afterward, when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies all around, Joshua gathered the tribes and admonished them to be steadfast in the observance of all that Moses had commanded and in the love of the Lord. Joshua then summoned the tribes to Shechem, and we finally reach today's second lesson.
A reading from the 24th chapter of the book of Joshua. Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel to Shechem, and summoned the elders, the heads, the judges, and the officers of Israel, and they presented themselves before God. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, long ago your ancestors Terah and his sons Abraham and Nahor lived beyond the Euphrates and served other gods. Then I took your father Abraham from beyond the river and led him through all the land of Canaan and made his offspring many. Now, therefore, revere the Lord and serve him in sincerity and faithfulness. Put away the gods that your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. Now, if you are unwilling to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Then the people answered, "Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our ancestors up from the land of Egypt out of the house of slavery, and who did those great things in our sight. He protected us along the way that we went and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we will also serve the Lord, for he is our God." But Joshua said to the people, "You cannot serve the Lord, for he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions of your sins. If you forsake the Lord and serve foreign gods, then he will turn and do you harm and consume you after having done you good. And the people said to Joshua, "No, we will serve the Lord." Then Joshua said to the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you have chosen the Lord to serve him." And they said, "We are witnesses." He said, "Then put away the foreign gods that are among you, and incline your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel." The people said to Joshua, "The Lord our God we will serve, and him we will obey." So Joshua made a covenant with the people that day, and made statutes and ordinances for them at Shechem. The word of the Lord.
This meeting signaled the beginning of what is called the Tribal Confederacy. In one way, it unified the tribes in the worship of the Lord, but it still left significant autonomy to the tribes. Think of the situation in the United States at the time of the Civil War. The North was a union, but the South was a confederacy, having only minimal control from above. Remember that, in fact, it may well be the case that not all the people were part of the Exodus. Some may have been relatives of some degree who did not go to Egypt with Jacob's family, and some may have migrated in from the east. This means that the ceremony at Shechem brought home to those outsiders the fact that God brought the core group out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and the outsiders were invited to appropriate this history for themselves, to choose to be part of this group. The book of Joshua is ended. We now turn to the next biblical book, the book of Judges. The book of Joshua is mostly a Deuteronomistic book, the D written tradition that I mentioned back in the first forum. The book of Judges is an old epic book, the older J and E traditions. An immediate clue that Joshua and Judges come from two different traditions is the fact that Judges chapter 1 has small groups of tribes fighting to possess territories that the book of Joshua indicated were already firmly in Israelite hands. Judges chapter 1 also indicates that the tribes had not completely driven out the original inhabitants, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, in the way that the book of Joshua told us. Judges 3 gives the reason for this. Now, these are the nations that the Lord left to test all those in Israel who had no experience of any war in Canaan. They were for the testing of Israel to know whether Israel would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their ancestors by Moses. So the Israelites lived among them, and they took their daughters as wives for themselves, and their own daughters they gave to their sons, and they worshiped their gods. The people obeyed the commandments of the Lord just about as well as their ancestors did. That is, not very. The general formula for the judge stories is the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, who strengthened some king or nation against them. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord raised up someone who delivered the people from their adversary, and the land had rest for some number of years. So there was disobedience. God then disciplined the people. The people repented and apologized. God sent a deliverer, and the people were delivered, and the story may be a sentence or multiple chapters. And they then behave for the next number of years, during which time the deliverer is judge over some portion of Israel. The Hebrew word translated as judge is shofet, which has strong overtones of ruler. In Isaiah 33, verse 22, in this long poem, it's, "For the Lord is our judge, our shofet, the Lord is our ruler, the Lord is our king, he will save us." The book of Judges has stories of about a dozen judges, plus some other stories in it. Only one of these roughly 20 stories is in the lectionary. So let's listen to our third and final lesson for today.
A reading from the 4th chapter of the book of Judges. The Israelites again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, after Ehud the judge died. So the Lord sold them into the hand of King Jabin of Canaan, who reigned in Hatzor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. Then the Israelites cried out for the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and had oppressed the Israelites cruelly for 20 years. At that time, Deborah, the prophetess wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramoth and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, son of Abinoam from Kedesh and Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go take position at Mount Tabor. Bring 10,000 from the tribe of Naphtali and the tribe of Zebulun. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you at the Wadi Kishon with his chariots and his troops, and I will give him into your hand." The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Note that we only get the first 4 of the 6 parts of a judge story. We hear of disobedience, discipline, repentance, and a deliverer, but we don't hear the delivery itself or the duration of peace in the land. Let me complete the story. Barak was a general, not a judge. After what we just heard, Barak said that he would go, but only if Deborah went too. Deborah said that Barak would not win glory because Sisera would die at a woman's hand. Barak then took 10,000 men to battle. The troop count is probably inflated, but we'll let that pass as poetic license. Sisera mustered his chariots and went out to meet Barak at Mount Tabor, and the Lord sent them into a panic. All of Sisera's warriors fell by the sword, but Sisera himself fled on foot. He reached the tent of Jael, wife of Heber the Kenite. She called to Sisera to come into the tent, gave him some milk, and covered him up, presumably to hide him, and then took a hammer and tent peg and drove the peg through his temple into the ground. When Barak came by, Jael told him that she had the man he was seeking. The story is then retold in poetry, which may be the oldest story in the Bible, and the land had rest for 40 years. The story of Deborah is important for at least 2 reasons. First, Deborah is the only female judge in the book of Judges. And secondly, God uses Jael, a woman, and someone outside the covenant group to effect God's deliverance. God uses the powerless to work his will. Thus ends our tour of the Year A Track 1 Old Testament lessons. I could and should have gone into more theological detail, but our time was severely limited. And I'd like to thank the readers I've had. Ann Seitz, our senior warden, Sarah Elizabeth McCandless, another vestry member, Jane Schlegel, one of the 10 a.m. readers, and Hannah Riley, our associate for congregational life. But there's one final matter I want to discuss. Several parishioners have asked me about the ages that have been given for the patriarchs. Do not take those ages literally. The intent was to say our ancestors lived a really long time. Back in the primordial history section of Genesis, it says, for instance, when Seth had lived 105 years, he became the father of Enosh. Seth lived after the birth of Enosh 807 years. Fathering his first child at 105 is pretty amazing, right? Well, the Septuagint, the 3rd century BCE Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Bible at the time, goes even further and says that Seth was 205 years old when he fathered Enosh. Well, they can't both be true, and one can say almost certainly that neither is literally true. This is looking back at a golden age. Men were stronger, more vigorous, long-lived, better looking than men now. You do not need to stretch your credulity and believe those numbers literally. Just think or remember that the people who provided the tradition looked with respect and at least a little longing at those who had gone before them. Also notice that the ages get much more reasonable as one progresses through Genesis and Exodus. It is claimed that the first 10 generations, the left-hand column, lived almost 1,000 years, from 930 all the way down to Noah at 950. The next 10 generations in the center column lived fewer and fewer years, Shem at 600, then Arphaxad at 438, down to 175 for Abraham. And by the time one gets to Joseph, who died at 110, we're at a bragging age, not that far from possibility. But for the patriarchs, the formula used for Isaac works perfectly well. He died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days. That's how you should read the patriarchal ages. And thank you for your attention and your patience.
I'd like to thank Jonathan for this wonderful series that he volunteered for. It was a wonderful series, and again, thank you so much as a special gift for your work. I have a mug that says Exodus Day 2, and one of the Israelites saying, "Are we there yet?"
Thank you very much.